Welcome back. This is the second chapter of lecture 6, and now I will talk about the faults, the issues with fast Fourier transform and how to solve these issues. So some other non-parametric methods for getting a nice spectrum without the issues. So what could be these issues with the fast Fourier transform? FFT is what you usually use in MATLAB, for example, for getting the spectrum of a signal, and it's quite fast, hence the name, but it has some problems. The first problem I should mention is the aliasing, and then we also have spectral leakage, which could be a high concern of ours, because for short signals we will have poor resolution spectrums. And then we have the time frequency uncertainty. We will talk about this the next lecture. And it could be complex, but nowadays having these fast computers, it shouldn't be considered as a complex process. So what are these? Comes the question. First of all, aliasing. So, if you are taking picture of stripes or a striped shirt or a bricked wall, then you will be able to see on the picture some patterns which are arising. Or if you have sound, you have a recording, a sound recording, and you have it sampled wrongly, we will see what is wrongly, then you will hear it distorted. So this is the phenomenon of aliasing. You might see it on this picture here. So if I start to zoom in, you start to zoom in and out on your screen, then you might see these patterns I'm talking about, these aliasing patterns. You will see these in practice too. But what is happening here? What's the problem here? So there are these stripes on this screen right now. And I have in this camera I'm recording with detectors. But what if my detectors are too far apart to catch this fine detail of striping? That is when the aliasing will happen, when you cannot catch these fine details and strange patterns will emerge on that screen or on that picture. So the problem is that you are undersampling your signal. And this is where the Nyquist theorem will come into picture, which says that your sampling frequency should be at least twice as high as the highest frequency component of your signal. So in this case, in this image, the highest frequency component is the striping of the screen, but the detector may not be fine enough to get this striping, to get this detail. It is undersampling. Or when you are playing with your screen, then in the screen you have the pixels, and the pixels might not be small enough to show these stripes. So this is what it's all about. If I show you a signal, this blue sign is our signal, and if I'm sampling it correctly, so at least with twice as high sampling frequency as the highest frequency component, which in this case should be at half of each period, so half of each period is sampled, then everything is okay. I can reconstruct my signal perfectly. But what if I'm sampling too sparsely? So here, my sampling frequency is that of the highest frequency, not twice as, only once the value of this highest frequency component. So here you can see that if I have these sample points, I can connect them two different ways. I can connect them with this high frequency line or with this slow frequency line. So you have multiple solutions, and this will be the ambiguity which causes these patterns. From a frequency point of view, what is happening? So the FFT, the fast Fourier transform, is actually periodic. So we usually plot only one period of it, from minus half of sampling frequency to half of sampling frequency, and that's all. But actually, in theory, it is periodic. So it is repeating periodically. You should put them next to each other until infinity. They are the same, but this is what you should do as from a mathematical point of view. And if we think about it like that, then you can see here that the red line is my original spectrum, and if everything is quite okay, I have sampled it perfectly or in a good way, then they are not really overlapping. So the next period, the blue one, is starting just next to it. It's okay. But what if they are too close together? So here it should be again this red line, but I'm pushing in the next period into the neighborhood of this first period. So they will be overlapping, as you can see here. The green period will come into the red period. So if you are reconstructing from this period, then you have too much information. You have this information of the upcoming period, and this way you will have these spurious patterns in your image or in your signal. Your signal will be distorted because you have this added frequency content which should not be there. Okay, the second one was the spectral leakage. In the spectral leakage, what we do is that we are taking only a given length of sample for a signal. So if you are recording, let's say, an ECG signal, then you are recording only it for 10 minutes or only for 2 minutes to see what is going on. And this time window will spoil everything. Because if you remember from the previous lecture, I have talked about windowing in the frequency domain. So I have mentioned that why don't we just get rid of frequency component by a simple rectangular window? And the problem was that in the time domain, it would cause a convolution with a sinc function. So this is happening here too, just in the other direction. So you can see that the long signal has a nice spectrum. It's quite nice. But for the short signal, you have this strange pattern, this sinc function superimposed with it. So in the time domain, you are multiplying by a rectangular window, which means that in the frequency domain, you are convolving with the sinc function. This will cause the spectral leakage. And how can we control it, comes the question. So your spectrum will have a resolution. This resolution will be that what frequencies can be told apart from each other, can be differentiated from each other. So is this a high enough resolution on the spectrum to tell that this is 140 Hertz and this is 150 Hertz present in my signal? This is what you can see here on the right, that we have a signal which is the sum of 140 Hertz and 150 Hertz signal. And you have the spectrum of it. In the first diagram, you have 101 samples, and in the second one, you have 67 samples. In the first one, you can see that the two frequencies at 140 and 150 are apart from each other. You can say that this is present and this is present too. But here, in the second case, when you have only 67 samples of recording, they are merged together. You cannot really tell them apart. So the thumb of rule to use here, when can you tell these apart, is that the width of this main lobe, which is, these are the lobes, and this is a main lobe which is at 140 or 150 hertz, is roughly the sampling frequency over the length of the signal. So in this case, we have 1,000 for 1 kilohertz for sampling frequency, and you had 101 samples. It means that the resolution, so the width of the main lobe, will be 10 hertz. So something at 140 and something at 150 hertz will be just separable from each other. While here, if you divide 1,000 with 67, you will have greater than 10 hertz. So the main lobe will be too thick, the resolution will be too low, and they will merge together. So this is spectral leakage. And this is something you should consider. And we will see other methods later which can handle this better. Another non-parametric method is the multi-taper method. So this is an attempt to make Fourier transform better, so not to suffer from spectral leakage, which is the highest of our concerns. Because if we use small signals, then we have a poor spectrum. So what multi-taper method does is to cut your signal into smaller bits, non-overlapping, this way orthogonal bits, and calculate the spectrum for each of these short segments. Once you calculate these spectra, you can average them. And this way you will minimize the variance of this spectrum. Why is this so? So if you remember synchronized averaging from the filtering lecture, then we have shown there that with the averages, so with the number of samples, the variance, the noise will decrease with these numbers. So the smaller the signal to noise ratio will be, the more samples you have. So you cut your signal into smaller bits, calculate their spectra separately, and then average all these spectra. This is one method for getting a better spectrum and to get rid of spectral leakage, get rid of this variance. Another method is the minimum variance method for spectrum estimation. In this case, you're using a bunch of filters. So you design a filter bank which has bandpass filters at frequencies of interest or at all frequencies. You filter your signal one by these filters, and their output will be some power. So you filter your signal with, let's say, with a 0 to 5 hertz filter. And for this output signal, which only has now the 0 to 5 hertz components, you take its power, and you will give this power, this number, as the amplitude of the spectrum at that given frequency point. So you have to design very good filters to do this. The quality of your spectrum will depend on the quality of your filter bank in this case. So they should be really sharp, so their roll-off should be small, their slope should be quite big, and they should be as small as possible to have a good resolution. But the problem is, as we know, that if we would use these square-shaped filters, which would be the ideal, then we would have again the problem with the sinc function. So it will be a compromise again to how good filters we can get. and to have the frequency components, the power, the energy, really only from that band, and not to have frequency components of neighboring bands. So this was the second chapter of lecture 6. For get to the next chapter, please take the quiz below.